Joseph Smith could not have known about how widespread the belief was among Native Americans about a great white God and how much they knew about Christian beliefs before Columbus, except possibly by revelation. Native Americans have many traditions about a bearded white God who visited them and taught them. Some sort of myth of return was also common. I am grateful to Elder Ted E. Brewerton for sharing with me material he had gathered over many years about the Great White God that includes writings of early friars and Christian missionaries, and in some cases, natives in Mexico and Central America. Different tribes have different names for the Great White God. He came and taught the people a higher way of living in such a way that they remembered his visit for centuries to come. First, we'll talk about Viracocha. Viracocha was the main god of the Incas in Peru and was worshipped as the creator of the world. When Viracocha visited the ancestors of the Incas, he promised that he would return. When Pizarro arrived on the shores of Peru in 1531, at first, the king of the Incas, Atahualpa, thought he was Viracocha returning as he had promised. It didn't take long for Atahualpa to be informed that this foreigner, Pizarro, did not match the character of Viracocha, but still, in his curiosity, Atahualpa agreed to meet with Pizarro. Even though Atahualpa had an army of 80,000 Inca soldiers nearby, the small group he took to meet Pizarro was ambushed. Atahualpa was taken captive and eventually executed. With fewer than 600 men, Pizarro took control of the kingdom of the Incas, which stretched from Colombia to Chile. It was after a period of darkness that Viracocha came to the ancestors of the Incas. He was described as a tall, white man. Viracocha taught them to be kind to everyone and to do good. He healed the sick and gave sight to the blind. He was described as white and bearded, wearing a long white robe, and he had marks in his hands. Now we'll talk about Quetzalcoatl. The situation with Quetzalcoatl is complex. Some researchers think that Spanish friars and missionaries, and in some cases natives, who wrote about native traditions in an attempt to convince the natives to convert to Christianity, may have embellished what they learned from native records and native informants to sound more like Christian beliefs. These researchers don't trust anything written after the arrival of Columbus. These are just two of the conquering Spaniards who ordered a mass destruction of native records. But those who documented native traditions soon after Columbus arrived had access to records and to people that no longer exist. Is it not overkill to completely discount what they wrote? Surely some of the writers were sincere and were trying to preserve native traditions accurately, but how can we tell which ones? Diane Worth, who has studied many of these traditions, has noted that when different authors have recorded nearly identical information from different cultures in separate regions, since it is highly doubtful that they could have contacted one another, their accounts warrant serious consideration. I will call this the Worth test, a way to determine which recorded traditions are of the most worth for serious consideration. One of the aspects of the myth of the Great White God that occurs in multiple cultures in separate regions is that the Great White God promised to return. This table shows common characteristics reported for each of these manifestations of the Great White God by widely separated tribes. For these traditions to have survived in such disparate places over a period of many centuries before the Spanish arrived, the coming of the great white god to their ancestors must have been a truly spectacular event. Cortes had fewer than 500 Europeans with him and had 6,000 warriors from other tribes. There were millions of Aztecs. According to the tradition, Cortes landed in the year it was predicted that Quetzalcoatl would return, and on the same shore where he had left and promised to return. Some scholars say that Montezuma II believed a tradition that Quetzalcoatl would return with other white-bearded gods who would bring a new age and rule over his people, and that this added to the king's reluctance to fully engage the Spaniards and their native allies in battle. Other scholars believe this idea was promulgated by Spaniards after the fact. This tradition is based on Cortes' own letters to King Charles V of Spain, and is recorded in such documents as the Florentine Codex, written by Sahagún. There were at least two Quetzalcoatls. Certain kings and priests of the Toltecs took upon themselves the name of the earlier god Quetzalcoatl. This increased their own fame and claim to the throne. The most famous of these was Topiltzin. Topiltzin's father had invaded and conquered the area and had married a princess. Topiltzin took upon him the name Quetzalcoatl and took upon himself some of the characteristics that had been attributed to the earlier Quetzalcoatl. Topiltzin went to Tolan, now known as Tula, Mexico, and reigned there for a time. He taught the people a higher form of life and forbade human sacrifice. After a time, he was expelled from Tula by political intrigue and then reigned in Cholula, Mexico for many years. Later, Topiltzin went to the coast and sailed away, promising that he would return. According to one author, he then went to the Mayan people, where he was known as Kukulkan. Quetzalcoatl in the Nahuatl tongue of the Toltecs and Aztecs means feathered serpent. In Mayan, Kukulkan means feathered serpent as well. Later Toltec kings went to other Mayans, where the same god was known as Itzamna or Gukumats. Topiltzin was not the original Quetzalcoatl. Topiltzin only took that name upon himself. The original was known as Ehecatl Quetzalcoatl. What is known of the ancient creator god Quetzalcoatl Ehecatl? Diane Worth wrote an article by this name, Quetzalcoatl, the Maya Maize God and Jesus Christ, in the Journal of Book of Mormon Studies that shows similarities between Ehecatl Quetzalcoatl, the Maya Maize God, Hunhunappu, and Jesus Christ. Both are creation gods, both are associated with resurrection, both are associated with maize and the Western Hemisphere. Maize, the Western Hemisphere bread of life. Where did Quetzalcoatl come from? He is known as the god of the wind or the god of the air. Kukulkan was the Mayan name for Quetzalcoatl. Kukulkan came down from heaven. Which Quetzalcoatl do you think this is referring to? To the man Topiltzin or the earlier Ehecatl Quetzalcoatl? Just like Viracocha, this Quetzalcoatl is described as healing the sick and giving sight to the blind. Which Quetzalcoatl do you think this was? Some of the early friars and missionaries were surprised how similar some traditions of the natives were to stories in the Bible. We will use what I have called the Worth test to consider whether some of them were interpolations by Spanish writers or whether they could have been original pre-Columbian traditions. So this was part of a history written about 1608 about the creation and the Great Flood by Fernando de Alva Ixtlilxochitl, who was of mixed Aztec and Spanish descent. This about the Aztecs was written in about 1780. The Aztecs had these traditions about the flood, and so did the Mayans. Diane Worth has said that most scholars agree that the Quiche Maya's Popol Vuh is the least corrupted text written after the conquest. So this quote came from the Popol Vuh about the flood. The Incas also had traditions about the flood. So we see that the Aztecs, the Mayas, and the Incas all had traditions about the Great Flood. This seems to pass the Worth test of multiple separated accounts in different cultures, so it warrants serious consideration. Manco Capac was the founder of the Incan dynasty in Peru hundreds of years before Columbus arrived. There is a story in which Manco Capac told those traveling with him that the rainbow is a sign that the earth would not be destroyed again by a flood. The Mayans in the Popol Vuh had a tradition about the people splitting from each other as their languages changed. This tradition of the Aztecs was about people who built a tower to reach heaven, but were afterwards dispersed. Lord Kingsborough's principal contribution was in making available facsimiles of ancient documents and some of the earliest explorers' reports on pre-Columbian ruins and Mayan civilization. Antiquities of Mexico is a 9-volume work published from 1831 to 1848 in England. He also records an Aztec tradition of the building of a high tower and languages being confused thereafter. Again, we have traditions from multiple cultures about people gathering to a city or tower and languages being split or confused from there. This, too, seems to pass the Worth test and warrants further consideration. The Popol Vuh was first recorded in Quiche, a language of the Mayans, in 1701 and translated into Spanish by Friar Francisco Jimenez. The title of the Lords of the Totonicapán was also written in Quiche about 1554. It was first translated into Spanish into 1834. Both of these mention a sea being divided and a path being opened for the people to pass through. Historia de las Indias de Nueva España was completed by Friar Diego Duran in about 1581. He spoke the Nahuatl language. So he got his materials from Aztec codices and from consulting native Aztec people. His work was criticized for helping the heathen retain their culture. Since the previous quotes were from Mayans who spoke Quiche and were not translated into Spanish until 1701 and 1834, respectively, there is no way that Diego Duran could have known about them, since he translated from the Aztec Nahuatl and published in Spanish in 1581. Again, we have different cultures in separate regions with similar traditions. This seems to pass the Worth test as well and deserves serious consideration. It appears that before Columbus, the natives even knew about the parting of the sea. the escape of their ancestors, and the destruction of their persecutors. How would they have known about Moses and the parting of the sea unless at least some of them were descendants of Israelites? Some of the natives also knew about the destructions in America at the time of the crucifixion. Fernando de Alva Ixtlilxochitl was an Aztec prince. After the Spanish came, they burned the historical documents that were in the Aztec archives, thinking that by destroying the Indians' culture, they could convince them to become Christians. This Aztec prince said, quote, "Of a truth, I have the ancient histories in my hand, and I know the language of the natives because I was raised with them. And I know all of the old men and the principles of this land. It has cost me hard study and work, always seeking the truth on everything I have written," end quote. His writings were discovered by Lord Kingsborough in England and not published until after the Book of Mormon was published. There was no way that Joseph Smith could have known about these calamities in America at the time of the crucifixion, except by revelation. The Spaniards and natives would have had no reason to falsify this record, since they didn't have the Book of Mormon. John Taylor, the third president of the church, said that the Creator, God, Quetzalcoatl, and Jesus Christ are the same person. This is a pre-Columbus statue of Quetzalcoatl with holes in his hands. This is the Mayan hieroglyph for Itzamna, another name for Quetzalcoatl. The hand has a hole in the palm. Lord Kingsborough discovered manuscripts that had been sent to England. He began publishing volumes of what he had found, including the Borgian manuscript. Lord Kingsborough published his books between 1831 and 1848, so there is no way Joseph Smith could have known, except by revelation, about these references in which Kingsborough interpreted the pictures as Quetzalcoatl being crucified. This is one of the images found by Lord Kingsborough. The Borgian manuscript was created before Columbus arrived. This is a Greek-style cross. Notice the sword in his side. Some scholars criticize this particular image since the hands and feet are shown tied, not nailed. But in two of the other images in the Borgian manuscript, it appears that there are impressions of nails in the hands and feet. Joseph Smith could not have known all of this about the beliefs of ancient Native Americans. This information was simply not available to him or to others who lived in his time, at least not all of it in one place. As Tad R. Callister said, Joseph, you see, must also have been a very, very lucky guesser. Somehow, in spite of all the odds against him, against all existing scientific and academic knowledge, he guessed right when all the others were wrong. The Book of Mormon truly is just what Joseph Smith said it was, a record written by ancient prophets that he translated by the gift and power of God.